I believe we're good to go, although the number of attendees is increasing quite quickly, but it's fine. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Chamber Talk. I am Sultan Hatoum from Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and I'm glad to have you all on this essential or must-have webinar before you get back to work with all engines on. This is our fifth session of the program and will be with Deloitte discussing crisis management in terms of key considerations of getting back to business. For the past few months, organizations and businesses across different sectors have had to face unprecedented challenges in light of the ongoing pandemic crisis. Efforts and initiatives have been focused on immediate response activities. However, as we pivot towards an outlook of recovery, it becomes important to shed light on the importance of adopting a risk-based mindset that balances reopening controls with economic effect. So with the number of businesses and employees getting back to work is increasing on a weekly, or I would say even on a daily basis, as restrictions or opening controls started to ease, it is vital to think of all the considerations that might have a critical impact on a strong and proper relaunching of your business. These considerations cover a range of vital areas, which will set up the road to your organization's resilience against COVID-19. In simple words, the presentation aims to help you manage the risk of disruption by directing your focus and efforts towards answering the following key questions. Where, how, and who will operate? What does your organization really value and want to protect? What does your organization need to be able to function during a disruption in terms of communication, policies, technology investment, and so on and so forth? And finally, is the organization's crisis management plan and function fit for purpose to assure business viability? All these considerations will be tackled by Tariq Ajmal and Omar Jabshi, our expert speakers for the day from Deloitte. A brief introduction about the gentlemen before we start. Tariq is a partner in risk advisory with more than 20 years of experience, serving large and complex global organizations around strategic and reputation risk, technology and digital risk, cyber risk, IT and process controls, as well as helping organizations with regulatory compliance. Tariq is also a regular public speaker in many forums across the Middle East region and is heavily involved in the setup and delivery of various training courses for staff and clients. Omar, our second expert speaker, is a seasoned resilience and crisis management professional with extensive advisory experience. He has assisted numerous organizations across many industry sectors within the region with steering their business continuity and crisis management initiatives onto the path of increased resilience. Most recently, Omar's focus has been on advising institutions on responding to the current pandemic. Omar has also published in leading publications such as Forbes and the BCI's Continuity magazine. So without any further delay, I will leave it to Tariq and Omar. But before make sure please to engage with us through submitting your questions in the Q&A box. And remember that you can join a parallel Arabic session with instant translation on the link shared in the chat box. Gents, it's all yours.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Sultan. And thank you to Abu Dhabi Chamber for inviting Deloitte, to the Chamber Talk. I think it's a great initiative, and we are very delighted to be part of this. Before I, start off, I would like to also, thank participants for joining. I hope you'll find this session useful, and through the Q&A, we'll be able to answer some of the questions that may come through. To start off, I will just set the context. I think we all know why we are here, what has been happening. We have been in this COVID situation for the last few weeks and months now, and this has been putting great strain on the infrastructure, business, individuals, and this has been impacting all of us. Now, with the time has progressed, governments are looking to balance the impact on health, well-being with the economy, and that's where you see a lot of talks, discussions, and plans to open up the economy which is where you all come in. And therefore, what are your considerations that you should be looking at as you start to open? And I think key point around this is that this is not going away just now. There are still, challenges and risks that we may face as we go along. There may be wave 2 and wave 3. Hence, it becomes very important for organizations to look at it as a, process and a program, not necessarily just, that's over, we come back and things are normal. So this is why it's important that we look at from this point of view. As I move on, I think why we should come back to a business. Some of it is, yes, governments are allowing it, restrictions are easing. I think in some cases we also see there are specific industry specific requirements for certain organizations in the type of business they do, or type of operations they have, or type of functions that they have, which require certain presence to make it effective. It's also about efficiency, because we all know face-to-face interactions and contacts make it collaboration much easier. There are certain facilities in our offices that makes it easier for us as well to do our job. And also, I think the security concerns. I think this last 2-3 months have really put strain on our IT and security functions to make sure to support this desperate and remote working environment. And it's also important to be taken care of from whether this can continue for a long term. So it's important from that perspective as well. And we've seen a lot of attacks and a lot of issues that have come in last few weeks as well around this area. So these are kind of few reasons that a lot of organizations are also looking to come back. Now, when we come back, I think very important is how do we go about it? And in many cases, organizations would have put together their crisis management command centers, task forces, PMOs, or equivalent functions. And these task forces and command centers, needs to continue throughout this, which is, linked to the fact that this is a ongoing process. It's not going to go away anytime soon. So we need to look at it as a formal process, and a team of leaders who are empowered and centralized to drive this rebuilding, restoring, and recovering focus. So these, functions or command centers typically will act as the face and arms of the organizational leadership in steering the organization from the recovery phase and beyond. They need to be looking at, sorting out some of the issues that we may face as we go along the journey. For example, these issues can range from what are those signals and indicators that are impacting our businesses? What are the key business considerations? What are the regulatory and legal, actions we should be taking? And I think there are about 10 areas that we looked at, which is where this, function can help organizations take actions and prioritize the focus. So first is, creating the situational awareness, knowing what is happening around us, getting all the insights to help us make, informed decisions. Helping set clear objectives during this time, as well as what are those indicators to help us monitor the progress and success as we move from respond to recover and then hopefully to thrive. Supporting some of the key strategic trust drivers. And what are those trust drivers? These are, in our view, the 4 of them. Number 1, the physical, the safety of how I will operate and where I will work. My emotional, impacts and how do we manage those. Financial concerns, as we all understand, and digital as well, which is really about how my information will be secured. Because in this context, organizations will be collecting different kind of or different set of data. So how do I make my employees and stakeholders, understand how I'm protecting those things? Then it's also about communicating accurate and reassuring and helpful information to the stakeholders. And this is where I think it becomes very important as well. It's about being transparent and to be able to build that trust that we're talking about. Now, as we continue journeying, it's also about building the organizational resilience, which is coming also from the lessons learned and what has worked and what are the areas that our organization should be looking to, continue enhancing as they go along this journey. We talked about the balancing, the near-term needs versus the long-term and strategic consequences of crises. These teams will also be making recommendations to management as well as escalating some of the strategic challenges. We talk about capturing lessons learned, so all the things that has worked and also not worked, so that how we can learn from them and keep our organization better for the new normal. Given we are into this state for next probably few months, so it's also very important to keep doing this scenario planning to understand the impacts to our stakeholder operation for evolving scenarios and upcoming scenarios, so we are better prepared as we move along. And last and not least is the enhancement of the response capabilities. Again, throughout this journey, and we have been supporting many clients, we have seen certain challenges as to how originally the programs were set up, how the crisis management was set up, how the BCM was set up, how much could be leveraged, not leveraged. So it's about also bringing all this together to help us continue to enhance those response capabilities, having the right structures, teams, plans, and updating them as we go along, so that we are better prepared for the what's coming in front of us. Now, moving on, in terms of overall consideration, this is where I'll pass on to my colleague Amar. But before that, I just want to set the scene. So here again, the decision drivers are coming from some of our internal inputs. That is where organizations standing. Some of what we're seeing, from outside perspective, social media and similar chatter. What we are hearing from health authorities, WHO, and the regulators. But in terms of defining the focus of the areas, there has to be a risk-based approach, which should then focus on these areas that we list here: communications, technology, especially the investment in digitization and automation, revisiting some of the policies that we had earlier but may not be as relevant today in the different world. The whole pandemic management protocol. This is around making sure in the new world, how do you manage the cases within our organization? The link to this is the facilities and building management, then operations of this, and of course, scenario planning. With that, I'll pass on to Omar to take us through this part of the presentation. Over to you, Omar.
Thank you very much, Claudia. I'd also just like to thank our participants once again for joining us. In fact, I'd like to thank Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce specifically today. Truthfully, it has given us the chance, I think, to connect with everyone. We do feel like we are part of, we're all responding to this together, I would say. It's something that has been unprecedented, and it requires all of us to come together, I think, to move beyond this pandemic, which is one of the world's biggest crises. On that point, Dora, as well, just to add, so in terms of that risk-based approach, I think one of the most important things that we are trying to focus on these days in response to the current situation is to really highlight that this is, at the end of the day, it requires an agile mindset. So it's not necessarily a one-time planning activity or a one-time plan that can be achieved where the organization sets that static path in terms of how we respond and it continues, but rather really requires a continual assessment process. So as the situation we've all seen, I think, has been evolving over the past few months, there are new challenges that have come up. There are new complications that we've seen, risks that may have not even been foreseen before. So the most important thing that before we, I think, get into the details for today's session is to really stress on this important point and say that it does require an agile mindset that is adaptive in nature, that focuses on continual surveillance, continual assessment. And, as the situation evolves, the nature of the controls that we apply, the mitigations, the plans, the protocols, the response mechanisms that we have will adapt and change throughout. And I think that is the one thing that we will, highlight as being constant throughout the response. Having said that, as you said, Tariq, there are different areas we focused on in this risk-based approach. Before we get into the actual actions that have to take place. So there are certain things that, every organization can take across those different dimensions that you explained, Tariq. But before we get into it, there is certainly, a sense of prioritization. So how do we go about this? It's not only the controls that we have to apply or the activities that we have to undergo, but really adapting that initial mindset of prioritization. And when we look at this, we are certainly looking at two main dimensions on this. The first one is to focus, and I'll look at the second one maybe more importantly initially, which is the geographic analysis part of the story. So on this, we're trying to say that, your business may be running from either one location or multiple locations. But in either case, your starting point is to look at that geography and say, this is a global crisis, that has spread everywhere almost, but with varying levels of impact, basically. So first of all, judging, the area in which you operate, the exposure levels that you have, especially if you have multiple locations within your organization, is your starting point. So how do we go from there? Where do I need to operate? And of course, as Sultan may have mentioned at the beginning of the call, as we now pivot towards that recovery phase, and we are focusing on, to some extent, sort of that recovery aspect of the whole crisis, and getting back, reopening business. One of the key questions will be, where do we operate? Where do we reopen as well? So that's the first thing. And then the second part is really the process analysis. So within each location that you have, once you've determined where do you want to operate or where do you want to reopen, is focusing on what do we need to do. So there are certain activities that would be naturally more exposed to risk, the risk of the pandemic and the infection and the transmission. And that's the other thing that we will highlight. So by looking at the process, the geography prioritization, and the main thing to highlight again on this here is it's the constant state of assessment to decide what decisions do we have to take. But so this is indicative in nature. But if you were to get the mindset behind this, basically the idea is, we're going to look at our business, the operating landscape that we have in terms of the locations, and we're going to look at what are the areas that we consider it's high demand. So at the end of the day, if we are experiencing some financial impacts, or there's a dip in the market in generally, we're looking at what are those areas or locations that generate the most profit or the revenue for the organization. So these are the high demand areas and the medium demand areas most possibly. So when we come and combine that with the dimension of which areas that I'm operating from are actually more risky, where basically you either have a large number of infections or there's insufficient living and social distancing conditions due to any number of root causes, you would basically try to combine these dimensions and say, for example, in a high demand area where it's a high risk area, you cannot just simply say, let's continue to operate it. There certainly needs to be an assessment with management on whether we operate or not. And if the decision is taken not to operate in that area, at the bare minimum, it would have been an informed decision where we said, we understand sort of, how much revenue that location is generating and how do we, what we are accepting at that level. At the other end of the spectrum, we can take an example of it's a low demand area, or even if we say it's a high demand area with a low risk, geography, then certainly the decision can be to continue to operate. So the key takeaway here is in prioritizing the geography, there's certainly that element of saying, what does that location do for us, and combine these to decide where to operate. And certainly it can be done in a phased way. So as you notice your high risk areas starting to come under more control, where the number of infections will get lowered, certainly they will move naturally to being a medium risk area where they start to moving from not operating into operating. So that's why we stress on that continual assessment process that we talked about. So as we move on, in terms of the prioritization of which work should also take place from every individual location, naturally you would look at the set of processes that you have. You would define those processes, and you would look at how much value they're generating for the organization, how essential they are. There are certain things that are not only revenue driven, but they could possibly contribute to the reputation or the position of the organization in the market. That's assuming that it's a profit organization. If it's a non-profit organization, it's its ability to play its role in the industry sector. So by looking at this and looking how risky that process is if we were to reopen it, and what would be the value of reopening that after the closures that took place, it's an assessment process that will lead you to that decision you have to take on what activities there is you. Of course, you might be asking, so why do we, if we've determined the geography, why do we also look at prioritization for the process? And the idea behind it is we would need to focus on, in the case of a crisis, especially on the people side, you might have your resources impacted. And if your resources are impacted, you would need to be able to prioritize the remaining task force that you have towards these critical processes. Again, the combination between the geography and the processes. So moving on to the next session, basically, we've tried to provide you with an approach. Again, this is indicative in nature in the sense that in determining who needs to attend basically across the different locations. You can, first of all, determine which employees are most prone to catching or spreading the virus, which can be done through a number of ways. Defining what we call high-risk populations within your task force. Those could be of a certain age bracket, which is naturally more susceptible if they pick up the virus. Defining basically as well susceptible, team members that are, for example, pregnant ladies, they are attended to in more detail. So that is the mindset that is adopted there in terms of finding, your population, knowing your workforce baseline as well, and then dividing the team based on a worst case scenario approach. So if you were to, after you've determined the geographies in which you need to operate and which activities you need to resume, again, it's a gradual process where you have either a shift-based approach or a risk-based approach to determining who comes first based on the demographics of the employees that you have. When we say demographics, of course, we mean in light of the extent of exposure that they might have with regards to the virus. So that takes us basically on to the next stage. So we've started basically responding. We've determined in which geographies do we operate, what activities should we really focus on, how do we gradually bring back the task force across these locations for those critical activities we're resuming. Then what does it look like basically for your organization to start moving across these stages of response? The way we've defined it is we typically look at having a simplified model in this, because at the time of a crisis, you always require something that is easily digestible, people can follow it in a nimble and agile way. So the idea is we define 4 levels or 4 verticals that allow you to shift from each intensity level to the next. So naturally, your first level is the crisis management response. And the way that you could look at this is you're defining different types of actions that need to be taken. So you could always think in a mode of a crisis, there are certain things that you should do. We're not doing before. Certain things you have to allow. There's certain things you have to stop. Maybe some things that you want to suggest and assess before you implement. So that's the other dimension that we applied there. And as you move through the verticals, just a quick example, and you look at for example, within the initial response on red, you'll have, non-critical on-site functions are prohibited from operating on-site. But as you start moving through different levels, you find that you are able to have those vulnerable populations on site, but it comes as well with your health surveillance mechanisms, the right types of controls that you apply across the facilities, the sanitization regimens, and all of that. And we'll talk about that in more detail, but this is just to indicate right now that in general, you would need to define those stages and the triggers between the stages. So, your teams and people would know how you're pivoting and moving across this. I think if we basically now start looking at those detailed consideration areas we talked about, and we'll take those one by one and provide, again, indicative, basically, the types of activities that you could consider across each. And as we said, this is not necessarily a finite set of actions that have to be taken. Depending on the operating landscape, the nature of exposure that your organization might have, you might adopt less, more. There's certain things that you can certainly add as the situation evolves. It's an adaptive process, and I think the reason, of course, we keep stressing on this is if you recall basically your organization and the teams, when the pandemic really started to break out in December, a lot of us were hearing COVID-19. We even started hearing the buzzwords of coronavirus, and should we not hear COVID-19? It was just a news article for people in the first week or two. People were following it. It was something to hear about. But as we proceeded, basically, and we started seeing the impact, the mindset that even people adopted has changed. The type of controls we've seen, in some cases, they've shifted from what we typically consider like a sanitary environment. Now there's a new normal for this. And that's applicable for all types of controls that we have relevant to the situation itself. So this is just to say that, in adopting these actions and these concepts, keep in mind that those will continually evolve. Leadership and thought leadership as well in the market across the different industries will evolve naturally as we proceed through this. So when we look at one of the first things on communication, certainly it goes without saying any type of crisis response will require effective communication. So some of the things that we're recommending on this front basically is certainly to have a task force that really focuses on that, and it reports to top management on these aspects. Defining the communication channels, basically. So you'll have that central pandemic task force, and you would want that to speak to customers, internally to employees, possibly even to the families of the employees, to give them, as Tariq said at the beginning of the presentation, the sort of the trust element and the emotional well-being as well. And you know, a lot of it will be, if you have any updated policies and procedures, communicating those the right way will be as well very important internally for the organization. A channel to receive employee concerns as well would be very, very critical as well. You know, as you find that organizations start to focus on the response, the employees are always wondering. They need to be kept in the loop. They need to be understand. They need to be reassured. You know, and an atmosphere of sharing basically, and effective communication and coordination becomes very important. So that is on the communication front basically. As we look at some other aspects, for example, technology investment or technology enablement, I think we have all felt basically that throughout the past few months, basically, as we all continue to operate remotely. So the way we look at it is, it's a given that, you know, remote work arrangements are even becoming the norm nowadays, but there are certain things that we have to consider along that journey. So it's not just about technology enablement, but there are certain concepts we have to keep in mind. So if you look at this almost like as a roadmap, certainly as you can see as well from what we have on the screen, is the enablement of that technology to work from home was the first thing that we looked at. And certainly that meant that we have to provide, you know, laptops, mobile devices to people. We had to ensure that our VPN clients on remote machines were connected. There's a lot of technical elements to make it happen, of course, but technically the technology capability had to be brought up relatively quickly to support the people in that mode. But what we continue to say is that as we start to adopt this, there is an element, of course, which is the second point you see, of how people will now adopt that technology. So it's not only just about having that technology there, but it's, you know, there needs to be support provided to the users and the employees on how to effectively use it, how to effectively collaborate. How do you continue doing what you used to do manually at the site or on site in that virtual fashion, and all the support that comes with that. Next to it is something that we certainly probably, you know, we all know about, is the cybersecurity threat of this. And naturally, as you start to, you know, operate in a more digitized fashion, comes with it the risk of cyber, basically. So IT teams, as Tariq mentioned as well, I think in the beginning of the session, there will be a lot of, you know, a lot of additional considerations they have to take on the security front. Technology investment, you know, what we may have had, for example, previously, and we've seen that across many organizations, is you would have had access or remote access enabled for a subset of your employees because it was not the new normal. As you proceed and it becomes almost up to 100% of your workforce will now need to operate remotely, there's certainly something on the capacity and technology investment that will need to take place. And that's where you see the next one, you know, provided that all the security concerns are actually mitigated, a cloud-based approach to move the systems that are cloud-based is one of the options that could be considered. Generally, that's due to the flexibility and how easily you can scale up and down in this. And keeping in mind that a pandemic is something that, you know, peaks very quickly and also might have different waves. A cloud-based solution to enable your people to operate can always help you scale down should things return to normal and you want to return to the office. Technology emergency budgets. I think emergency budgets are not necessarily limited to the technology aspect, but across all types of response activities that will need to take place to react to this pandemic. And last but not least is looking at aspects such as, it's not necessarily just virtualizing the environment, but digitizing a lot of it. So, you know, the new normal, as we call it, has brought in a lot of new considerations in terms of, can we use AI for some of the tasks? How can we introduce a lot of digital aspects basically to streamline, whether it's you know, chatbots, for example. How can we increase efficiency through the technology? So that's why you see this at the end, and it's towards the end of the continual roadmap that you see there is this mindset has brought in a lot of considerations for how technology can change some of the landscape through which we operate. On the policy side, we can see that there's a whole range of actions that can be taken, but those will naturally need to be supported by policies for you to be able to implement them. One of the most important things we always say in this case is a declaration policy. So you would want for you to be able to assess, as we said, your employees and their, you know, where do they fall on the risk scales, basically, in terms of how vulnerable they are to the pandemic or the virus itself. You would want a declaration policy. So people would need to declare, as an example, in the past 2 weeks, whether they've had high-risk exposures. Have they dealt with someone that was infected? Have they shown any symptoms? Has there been any travel? Of course, travel is restricted nowadays, but as we start to reopen and we seeing the controls, adapting to some level of travel allowed, you would want to focus on that declaration from users. A digitization policy to make sure that we're able to have something that supports the solution come in. Remote work policy as well. Is the need for us to work remotely? What are the requirements, the boundaries, the special considerations that need to happen? Benefits and compensation policy is something that is up to every organization, of course, depending on their appetites, their financial situations, the performance that happens during those periods. But again, it's something that a lot of organizations are looking into, and any changes should always be supported by a formal policy that is clearly communicated as well. Training and development certainly on the new normal and a lot of the new social gathering policies. Not only is it social distancing guidelines that we have within the facilities and how we implement this, but also, how do we educate people about what's happening? How do we tell them that even outside the office, you need to maintain certain gathering policy guidelines? At the end of the day, a lot of the support that is provided to personnel and employees in this case is not only just boundaries of the on-site presence, but providing the right type of support to employees. And that's what we sometimes call extended support to employees, whether it's the, mental well-being is one of the most important things, for example, that can be provided. First element to the emotional well-being. People need to feel that, their people are actually catered to. So, as we said, basically just on the pandemic management protocol, there's a whole range of actions that could be implemented from, physical and environmental. Sanitizations, equipment to be distributed across the workforce, across the workplace, the use of personal equipment or PPEs as you may hear them, and making sure staff, customers have access to places where they can wash their hands and so with the water. And we all know, I think, that goes in here. Not to spend too much time here, I think there is the key point to highlight. There are guidelines that are being issued. The public sensitive issues that are followed, the key point is there is a focus on prevention in this, and all these guidelines should be enforced on site as well as communicated to people from an awareness perspective. Okay, I think we'll proceed. And as we said, we will break out basically within, I think we'll continue for about approximately 10 minutes, and then we will allow room for questions. We'll have a Q&A session on this. So on the next two or three remaining areas, basically just to highlight, and those are again all, as we said, areas that will be combined as part of that risk-based approach that we take. But on the facilities, certainly we've all heard about the importance of disinfecting the locations before we have anyone coming back on site. Of course, so again, the idea behind it here is there's a lot of physical controls that can be adopted, whether it's social distancing in common areas such as the elevators, controlling the entrances properly, the thermal sensing capabilities that should be, the disabling or discontinuing some of the, things that generally have a high exposure element to them, such as valet parking or meeting rooms, basically any gatherings that should take place. So in general, it's all about social distancing as well as minimizing the exposure across the facilities. But you'll always see as well, there are certain things as well that can be adopted as we return to the office, for example. You look at, do we redesign some of the offices? Do we have the capacity anyways to redesign some of the offices we have? To not only react to it, but to have it as the new normal, basically, to have a certain minimal safe distance between employees. Where we're looking at sneeze guards, especially for organizations that are customer or client facing. That interaction might be happening more frequently than teams that operate from within their offices and they are socially distanced within. So again, as we said, it's a risk-based approach, always determine the extent of the exposure, the type of the exposure, and accordingly applying the right type of controls. Moving on to the next area, which is when we look at the operations. So, everything we've talked to up to this point has been about, certain surrounding elements. So the communication, the technology to enable the work. We've looked at the policies we need to be able to support how things will change during this period. Some of the building and facility management controls, physical and health and safety perspectives. But when we talk about the core operation, this is where it will really as well differ from one industry sector to the other. And if we look at this, there's certainly a common, roadmap that organizations can follow in this. But along that roadmap are certain key assessment points. But if we look at what we're trying to show here, basically is, one of the first things you'll do, of course, is to return to work according to the phases we just described. So we are going to define those 4 stages, or even more, up to the nature of the organization. And as we shift through them, we need to manage the return through these phases. Declaration forms need to be provided both not only to employees but any visitors actually that come on site, especially if, again, like we said, it's a customer-facing environment where the customer on-site presence is really required. Another thing that can be done in the core of the operations itself is that the working hours could be reduced, and not necessarily to affect productivity, but really to minimize the exposure in terms of on-site physical space. And if there's any percentage of the work that can be done remotely, it should be continued in that fashion. So we're trying to the best of our ability to minimize any on-site presence. What we look at as well is determining how dependent we are on third parties. It's not only that the third parties might not be able to come on site to support you, but it could be, that the employees of that third party are impacted. And if their ability to continue to serve you through their products and services is impacted, it might in turn affect you. So early on in the process, just make sure that you communicate with those third parties and understand the extent to which they've impacted. And even if they haven't, if they are impacted, what does that translate for you? Minimizing usage of anything, not only hard copy documents, but any physical items that might be required. Positioning and introducing new products and services. So, in the wake of the new normal, as we call it, you might find that you're losing a lot of revenue streams on some of the key products and services because the nature through which it's delivered, it's generally very in-person. Or it's we look at for example, the food and beverage industry, the hospitality industry. Those were initially impacted due to the nature of it being a social gathering atmosphere. Moving on, we look at deploying enterprise cost reduction initiatives, and that's naturally where the organization would look at streamlining its numbers in light of the financial impacts that's taken during the crisis. Diversifying supplier sources. We've talked about understanding the risk of third-party unavailability, but the solution for that would be the diversification. Are there alternate parties that we can deal with to ensure that the supply chain we have is not heavily impacted? And then you still have a few more things that could be considered, which is looking at outsourced contracts, especially if your internal workforce has been impacted. And having, for example, electronic signatures, as you may have all seen, like during this period, have become more prevalent and more accepted. And last but not least, minimizing the visitors that you might have on site. So that's within the area of the core operation itself. Now, when we talk about scenario planning, I think this is one of we wanted to leave this to the end, but for a reason, because we feel that the way forward from here basically is really about scenario planning. So everything we've talked about today, you may have seen that, these are considerations, actions, controls that can be implemented. Of course, in light of the risk-based approach that we talked about, to prioritize your geographies, your critical processes, and everything else that feeds into that risk-based approach. But the key important thing is, where do we go from here? We've implemented these controls. We are monitoring directives, and that's another very important thing as well. Monitoring government directives during this period is something very essential. So where do we take it from here? We need to look at the scenarios that will impact our industry, our specific organization within that industry as well, according to our current circumstances. What if my workforce is more heavily impacted? So you will notice that there's a general atmosphere of saying right now that the initial response and the initial peak was there, and maybe across the world you see different varieties or variations of the situation dwindling down, and there's a sense or a general atmosphere of saying we are approaching reopening. But in doing so, I think a very important thing to note is it might not be the only wave. So I'm sure you hear about it in the news. There's always the potential for a second or third wave. Given that this is the case, I think this is one of the main triggers that can feed into that scenario planning. Assuming that there might be a second or even a third wave, how does that impact us? Based on what we've seen, we've been impacted in the first wave, and how it could potentially be either milder or more intense. So again, the mindset is to weigh in and test multiple futures, maintain strategic options that you might think about. A lot of these options could be, could have been previously in the pipeline, but now they come back to life in light of the current challenges that we have. Focusing on long-term changes in the demand, so anticipating what that is, and finally, looking at the key outcomes you need to basically to have in place. So everything we've talked about today, we'll just do a very quick summary. If you were to operationalize all of this on the communication side, you need a task force, communication channels defined, and multiple ways of raising the awareness. On the technology side, I think we've looked at the remote enablement and the security controls that have to be enabled, as well as some consideration for automation and AI, a whole range of policies that you can actually implement on this to support the activities you take. A lot of the hygiene and prevention controls that you have to look at, supported by the right awareness. And on the facility level, everything you need to implement in terms of your social distancing guidelines and all the controls that will minimize the on-site risk exposure. And then we look at the operations and the scenario planning, basically. So on the operations, again, as we said, everything you need to change in terms of the operating landscape or adjust, let's say, not necessarily fully change. And last but not least, the way forward is scenario planning. Given everything we've done and everything we know today and everything we might anticipate might impact us, let's look at defining that, those set of scenarios and trying to adapt and plan accordingly, basically. So this brings us to our session. I think it does still leave us with about 15 minutes for the Q&A session. So I think we'll take it, Sultan, with you, and we'll pause right here.
Yes, thank you, Omar, and thank you, Tariq. We've received a couple of questions. So I'm going to start with this one. If someone is asking if my organization has not yet accelerated any initiatives or actions in response to the ongoing pandemic, where do you think we can start? Are we too late to start now?
That's a very interesting question, Sultan. In fact, you find that the initial period of speculation, I think, in light of this, the pandemic itself, just to quickly mention, it's a global crisis that has generally been unprecedented. So you can see in scale across as geographic dispersion, it's a tricky situation. So a lot of organizations have been in that mode of speculation of knowing where do we go from here. So if you were to take one action, maybe that can be taken immediately as a next step, if not much has been done, basically it would be really to establish what we call a command center. So the command center is your real, it's the brains of the operation in terms of running your response to COVID. And that will include, setting up the right team, the task force, the right management support and oversight, and the roles and responsibilities to drive this forward. So if we can take one thing maybe out, is to really establish that task force as soon as possible, and then naturally proceed from there with the right prioritization on this.
If I were to add to Omar, I think throughout this webinar, a lot of things that we talked about or covered are something that can be even applied today. If somebody has not even done anything so far, I'm sure everybody would have done to their capacity in terms of what is relevant to their organization. But these are some of the additional considerations that they can start with. And to Omar's point, having that one body, task force, PMO, you can name whatever you want to name it, but that's something that can own and drive these would be the most critical portion. And as you go along, then you learn, throughout the process, you will prioritize on focus areas for your organization, and then, start expanding to make sure that you're not only tied up with the actual response and recovery, but also looking at the strategic implications of all this and seeing how you can go to business that is better. How you've learned from, this, and how you can make it better for the future. There are a lot of things that you would have seen that has, through digitization and other aspect, can, make your business better. And we have been working with some clients, supporting them in the live response, and there are a lot of good examples that we have seen that it's not about only response, but those good practices can be taken in the new normal, and those are also very good consideration to be looking at.
Yeah, I would expect. I mean, people. This is definitely a learning opportunity, and the people would be developing this as they go and as they're experiencing it every day. So another question from Zishan. You've mentioned, Omar, on the reducing the number of working hours on site. So his question is, what's the ideal number that you suggest should be at workplace, like 6 or 4? I know this is probably a tricky question, and there is no right or wrong answer for it. It depends on case by case, but would like to have your insights on it.
Of course, I think the answer as well, thank you for that question, is again goes back to, as we said, it's a mindset rather than a specific direction or action. So the idea behind the working hours concept, as an example, you could argue that if I restrict the working hours to 4 hours instead of 5 or 9, instead of 8 or 9, the exposure might still happen on the third hour and 59 minutes. People actually make it. So the idea behind it is not necessarily that there's a right number for the hours that would completely eliminate your risk, but it's more about trying to minimize the exposure that you have. And I think that's again the mindset we're trying to talk about here is as we go from a complete lockdown into we start to look into reopening, and we start to look at, a lot of people say it's about loosening the controls. It's not necessarily about loosening the controls. It's more about adapting the right controls for the right level of risk exposure that you have. So again, there's certainly no correct answer on this to say this number of hours, but it's an appetite thing. Depending on the nature of your operations, depending on the nature of exposure you have, I think you might want to look at determining the right number of hours. But certainly starting by a shorter number of hours and then assessing whether that's being effective will lead to the right answer eventually.
Okay, cool. Another question from Samir on the scenarios. So he's asking how many scenarios are ideal? What would you look at as a worst case scenario?
So the way we look at it is, first defining the types of scenarios you want to look at. So first of all, there are strategic scenarios you want to look at. For example, loss of market share, loss of revenue streams on your core products and services. And there's other types of scenarios that you look at, such as the extent to which my workforce is actually impacted from like an infection perspective, for example. So when you look at the number of specific number on it, again, there is no set number, but I think it's the quality and the type of scenarios that you would define. So it's not about, you could define tens of risks basically, but if not capturing the key ones in that, this is where the exposure might not be mitigated. But if we had to start with something, I would say maybe look at the potential impacts on your products and services. That's one major scenario that has a lot of sub scenarios under it, of course. Another scenario would be to look at how your people may be impacted, not only from a an health and infection perspective, but their productivity, their well-being, their mental health being, the support you extend to them as well for their families. So I think, and Tariq, I think you correct me if I'm wrong on this, but there are a whole range of scenarios that can be considered on this, but those would be the key ones to start with at least.
Exactly, and I think this is dependent on organizations. What is important. In some organizations are also looking at what you call time-based scenarios. For example, so immediate. So you're looking in next 2 months, 3 months. If this continues the way we are operating today, with, let's say, I know there was some remark on the chat board with somebody they can lock down between Dubai and Abu Dhabi and similar other restrictions. So what's the impact? Once opens up and the other restriction put in place, then what do we do? So there are all those considerations that we can build it, what is relevant to the organization. But more importantly, for these 3 scenarios or 4 scenarios, and of course, like Deloitte and others have also done a lot of these thought leadership studies on, scenarios, even more from strategic and long-term perspective. It's about really understanding those impacts to the business and the stakeholders, for each of these scenarios, and then putting those mitigation actions so you can take informed decisions on what you need to do for those impacts to your organization. So again, there's no number, but typically we've seen 3 to 4 scenarios that organizations work with. If it's too many, then you're putting too many things to look at. If it's 1 or 2, then it's 2, maybe limited. So most cases we have seen 3 to 4 scenarios typical organizations work with, and these are kind of revisited on a regular basis and evolving, so that as things progress, you can revisit some of these scenarios to see what are the changes that you need to bring into your organization.
Great. Thanks, Tariq and Omar. I have a question on the investments required. So Dr. Luai asks, the response requires significant investment in most cases, including software and hardware. How can companies leverage these investments such that they are not just short-term investments that will just be lost once the COVID-19 situation is over?
Certainly, I think a lot of it would have to do as well, as we said, with how the technology that you adopt can possibly change some of the ways of doing things. So when we look at a technology investment on the artificial intelligence side, that's something that is transformational in nature. That's something that is a bit more long-term in nature. Mind you that this requires a mindset, of course, of saying that there's a new way of doing things as well. When we look at, for example, the remote work enablement, this is something that some organizations might view as very temporary. If they don't have the appetite, let's say, to shift to a new normal of having everyone or the majority operating remotely, or the operating landscape does not allow it. But other organizations might say, not only am I going to adopt a remote work policy and the technology that enables it, but rather I'm going to use that as part of a new normal, where I will really minimize the office space that I require to own or lease, which will then have an impact on your OPEX and CAPEX. So I think these are just two examples of how that can be transformed to long term.
Okay, we have a question from Jawad on specific to the services sector. So services is one industry which will have to be hands-on on the ground and cannot go to work from home option and digitally. How do you think they can survive?
We've seen a lot of organizations actually adopting what we call telepresence, so transforming the nature through which they deliver the service into a telepresence mode. Provided that it is possible to do so, during the initial stages, you might face some efficiency or some effectiveness challenges in this. But certainly, telepresence is one of the main concepts that we're feeling, and that we differentiate that from remote work in the sense that employees can work from home or remotely, doing the primary tasks that they have in some cases. But telepresence is about maintaining that interaction as well with your customer base. So we've seen that in healthcare, we've seen that in other industries as well, that it works effectively. There are always certain services that require, at the end of the day, that on-site presence, but to the extent possible, telepresence has been one of the main ways to enable that.
And I think, Sultan, to add to Omar, one aspect telepresence, but also, the things that we talked about in the seminar. Again, I go back to, the pandemic management protocol. So building those practices as part of your on-site presence, so you're managing those risks as part of the online operation. So the whole facilities management protocols, operations and policies and communication. Because if you can't avoid it, then you need to find ways to get best of it through addressing those practices that we were not used to doing it before, but now we have to bring those into our operations. So in situations whereby there's no other option, then we need to make sure that those businesses have enabled appropriate practices along with communication and awareness for the employees, so that this can be sustainable. Because what you don't want is you go back, open, and guests come back and you shut down again, and then it's impacting you from business perspective again.
Okay, I believe for the sake of time, we can still accommodate one more question. There is a question from Nawal on how they can redesign the budget according to the current situation. I know that this is a topic, Nawal, which we're going to be covering on different sessions. But if you have anything to add, Tariq or Omar, before I ask the last question, feel free.
So I think a lot of it will have to do as well with looking at, if you look at their, it's possibly not necessarily a restructuring of the budget structure itself, or maybe the type of expenditure that could be there. So we had a question, for example, about technology enablement. If that is something that requires investment on the technology side, do we consider that something that we use temporarily, such as, for example, a cloud-based solution that will have an OPEX impact on your budget? Or is it that we want to implement a long-term solution that requires a CAPEX element to it? That is one example. If we look at what type of emergency funding might be required, provided this is approved by management, this is again a type of expenditure that will appear there, I think, and it requires the right mindset to do so. And Tariq, from a restructuring perspective, is there anything else that?
Yeah, I think, Sultan, as you said, we are not the really experts on the finance matters. And I know you have a section planned, but I think it's about reprioritization, really. What is important, because you have limited money. So where you want to focus that money on? What are those priorities you want to drive this forward? That's all I will say. But I think that, that can have a, much more specific consideration for budget, reprioritization, revisited. So I'll stop it from my side.
That's why I said that to Noel, we're going to cover this in two different sessions in the future. One with Deloitte on liquidity solutions, and another one with EY as well around I would say liquidity solutions. So the last question from Imad: although ad hoc in nature, my organization is responding to COVID-19 to the best of its ability and available resources. Do you still need to have a business continuity management program in place?
That is actually a fantastic question. In fact, the simple answer is yes. What you've seen today is organizations are responding to the pandemic itself. But a business continuity management program will, it will enable the organization to deal with any type of incident it faces, both from a crisis management perspective, as well as incidents that are disruptive in nature. So the answer is certainly yes. It's certainly something that will take some time to develop, but beyond, this is something you can look at as part of the recovery phase. So as we emerge from this, an initiative can be rolled out in parallel to start developing that recovery capability through BC.
And Sultan, I will just add, Omar, because at this point, yes, we are all focused on this pandemic. But the other risks are not necessarily going away. They are there. And you can get impacted by those cyber attack or some other failure, fire in your building, and those kind of things too. So it's about, yes, we have all focused on this. A whole attention is gone to pandemic, but we need to be ready for others as well. And this is where I think the resilience is all about, getting ready and be prepared and predicting what else can happen, and are we ready to respond to those things, and can we recover, in a way that doesn't impact our business. So hence, having those resilience, that's why, when I talk about that, command center, the whole organizational resilience needs to be looked at, and keep enhancing your, response mechanisms to not only address this, but also other, type of risks and threats that your organization may face.
That's true, Tariq. I mean, life will continue, and the other threats will remain there. The COVID will not wipe them out. So thanks for the final note. Any final note on your end, Omar, before I wrap up the session?
I would just really like to renew our thanks to you, as well as to Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce, genuinely for allowing us the chance to connect with the community on this. We feel it's part of a bigger response that we all come through together.
Same, I'll say, what Omar said. Thank you very much for having us. It was great to be part of this, and we look forward to continue to contribute and support this. And I think this is a great initiative, and I think it brings together community into a platform, and hopefully addresses some of the burning questions. Thank you again. Thank you.
It is our pleasure to have you, gents, and thank you again for the insightful session. And to all our audience, thanks for joining us today as well. We hope that Chamber Talk is shedding light on some of your concerns, and that you're leveraging the guidance and advice provided by our guests. In conclusion, as we have set the tone at the beginning of the webinar around maintaining a balance between reopening controls and economic effects, it is vital that you think of all the considerations highlighted by Tariq and Omar, and seek advice as deemed necessary throughout your preparation for the new post-COVID-19 era. If you couldn't join the session from the beginning, please do visit our YouTube channel and Facebook page for the full recording, as well as for the recording for all the previous sessions. On Tuesday, we'll discuss education as an enabler of economic activity in the context of COVID-19 with EY Parthenon. We hope to have you all on Tuesday too. So before closing the session, allow me to wish all fathers a happy Father's Day. I believe we deserve a bit of attention. Until then, stay safe and see you later. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.